And welcome everyone to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series, our first episode for the 2022-23 academic year. Tonight's session is titled Misinformation, Assessing the Threat and How to Address It. I'm joined by Dustin Carnahan, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Communications at Michigan State University. Today is August the 30th. Hey, it is so wonderful to see so many familiar names and faces in the audience tonight. Thank you so much for joining us here at the beginning of the new academic calendar. If I'm honest, it feels in some ways like just a few days ago we concluded last year's season in early May, but at the same time it feels like a long time. And I hope that the end of your last school year, that your summer was fulfilling and full of self-care. I hope you still have sand and sunburn and are sort of readjusting to your new professional timing of your day. And I also hope that you're optimistic about the coming year. I'm continually reminded, both as an educator, as a parent, as someone who works with a lot of teachers, that you're facing unprecedented challenges. And it's not just differentiating complicated content so that students can understand it, but it's all the other variables that are disrupting what is your own professional goals. And I hope that we can be here to assist you in that. On behalf of my staff, I want to welcome you. Meredith and Mike and I are welcoming a new team member this year. Raven Ferguson is joining us as the Education Programs Coordinator. It's likely Raven is the person that you'll be in communication with if you ever have questions about our webinar series, whether that be the certificate that will be produced at the conclusion of tonight's session, or perhaps some questions about upcoming registration that you may have done. One thing that we all have in common, the four of us, is that we've been classroom teachers. And so our worldview is very much that of an educator, and we are very open and very explicit about our goal in helping you develop the agency and the confidence and the background knowledge that you need to handle these complicated topics. I also want to recognize that we have a lot of familiar and new faces in the audience tonight. Hey, Jewel, it's great to see you over in Wake County Schools, not too far from me, here in my home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. William is joining us from Springfield, Illinois. Jeremy is joining us from New York tonight. Great to see you tonight, Jeremy. Garrett from East Connecticut State University. Margarita, it's wonderful to have you in the program. Margarita is at the University of Kansas and has done some work with the center before. Carrie is in Florida. Stephanie is in Ohio. Andrea is in Spokane, Washington. Angela is in Wilmington, Delaware. Beth is in Kentucky. Hey, Lauren, thank you for joining us from Tuscaloosa. It's great to see you joining us, too, as a member of the University of Alabama faculty. As always, I want to welcome our Los Angeles cohort and crew here tonight. Megan and Gabriella, Nick, Ben, Meredith, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining. Please do share the upcoming webinars with your colleagues, both in your schools and your network. We would love to welcome them to the program as well. I was at the, I was at the center today, located in Durham, North Carolina, and it really does have the feeling of the beginning of the school year. There are boxes everywhere that haven't been unpacked. There are workmen who are trying to finish that last bit of painting or sweep away some sawdust that might be in the corner. The kitchen is getting prepared. Our fellows, our new fellowship class, will be arriving next Tuesday. They arrive on the day after Labor Day, traditionally. And we'll be welcoming 36 new fellows to the center who will engage with humanities research and writing and conversation for the next 9 months, their academic term. One of the things that we frequently encourage them to consider as they come into this year is that they have been given complete intellectual freedom to take that work and that research and those interests anywhere it might take them. But the thing that seems, in my view and my experience there after 8 years, the thing that seems to nudge them in different directions the most is by talking to other colleagues who are from different disciplines and different fields and different universities. And it's that sort of organic conversation of seeing things through another disciplinary lens that really seems to advance their work the most. I do encourage you in the time that we spend together to also, as best you can in this virtual format we're in, to engage with others who are in the webinar, thoughts they have, ways they approach different challenges or successes that they could herald, whether that's by grade level or by district or by state or by discipline. I do hope that you find some benefit and some value in getting to know each other as best you can in this somewhat limited platform. And that starts with the opening question. I want to thank all of you for responding to that and sharing the ways that you address these kinds of issues in your own teaching. You can find the resources to support that work in the Humanities in Class digital library. This is where we'll be focusing all of the materials that we offer you in advance. I think it's highly valuable that each of our speakers, including Professor Carnahan, has taken the time to pull together some readings or viewings or short passages that can help you reflect on the session, but can also give you some preparation for the live event. Once you go to the webinar series in the group, you can find the associated readings. They may be readings from news sources like Politico. It may include larger and very valuable tools like the Debunking Handbook from 2020. And these are things that I hope that you take some time to go back and reflect on after you spend the 90 minutes with us in the live event. As I look back over the last three years, I've noticed my own self-conscious is the word, subconscious, or maybe even very intentional plan to host sessions around mis and disinformation at the beginning of the year. It does feel in many ways that it's one of the most existential crises that we're facing, maybe, and that as educators and parents, we really have a lot of responsibility for that. One of those responsibilities, though, might be to emphasize that this is not unique to the 21st century, that in fact, mis and disinformation has been around for many moons and generations. We do have some future webinars scheduled that do address this long view. That includes our work with Jordan Taylor in the spring on fake news and media literacy during the American Revolution. It includes our work in the spring with Paul Hirsch on propaganda and the way it was used in comic books during World War II. And it also includes some more contemporary questions like, does contempt belong in social and public life, with Krista Thomason, past fellow here at the center and professor of philosophy at Swarthmore, and as well as Michael Altman, Lauren, one of your colleagues down at the University of Alabama, who will be sharing just a wonderful digital resource project on the teaching of January 6th, and in particular, the role of religion in that. If you are fascinated, if you're interested in ways to address misinformation and disinformation in your teaching, please do consider joining us for any or all of those sessions. I also want to remind you that we do have online courses that give you a deeper dive in these materials. That includes a 35 professional development credit hour course on critical media literacy. The first session opens on September 12th, and we would love to have any of you sign up for that. I want to thank our new Teacher Advisory Council for joining our team and beginning the process of contributing to all of the work that we do. These 20 educators represent different fields and schools and grade levels from across the country, including post-secondary. And we're really looking forward to getting to know them in a 2-day retreat at the center in about a month, as well as to welcome their contributions to things like our webinar series. It's great to see some of them in the room tonight. So that was my introduction, but I do want to do a quick review, particularly for those of you who have not attended one of our webinars in the past. This platform is a little different than maybe what all of us are getting used to, and frankly, I'm kind of relieved. I think there is such thing as Zoom fatigue, and we get kind of tired of looking at each other. So this is an audio-only presentation, but it does come with an associated PowerPoint that's been developed by Professor Carnahan, and he'll be leading us through this discussion by using that PowerPoint, and you'll hear both my and his voice at different parts during the next hour and a half. Your participation, though, is absolutely critical to making this a vibrant and compelling session, and you do that in two ways. To begin with, you use the audience chat, as you've been doing. It's in the, I believe for you, it's the lower right-hand corner in green. It might be on the lower left-hand corner. And you are welcome to share any thoughts you have. They can be spontaneous, they can be impulsive, they can be fun, they can be irreverent, they can be resources or thoughts or questions or URLs and links. If you have something, though, that you'd like us to address more formally, then I'll ask you to submit that right next to the number 3 red arrow where it says Ask Professor, Ask the Professor. And you could submit your question, and as the moderator, I'll queue those up and sometimes combine them, sometimes reframe them a little bit and bring them to Professor Carnahan when the time seems right. Please do take some time to communicate. There's a lot of value to being able at the end of a long school day to sit back and listen, and if that's what you'd like to do, you're more than welcome to. I hope it's valuable. And if you've got thoughts to share, we would love to incorporate them into tonight's session. So again, I want to thank you for joining us for the first episode of the 22-23 National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Misinformation, Assessing the Threat and How to Address It. Tonight's talk is being led by Dustin Carnahan. He's an assistant professor of communications at Michigan State University. Hey, Dustin, can you hear me up in Michigan?
I can. Thanks for that
so
introduction.
Great to have you. Of course, and I really do appreciate you taking time for you as a busy beginning of the year as well. You're also rolling through class rosters and figuring out, your syllabi and kind of what comes next. So I appreciate you taking time to spend with us. In a moment, Professor, I'm going to turn over the PowerPoint to you and let you walk us through the talk that you've prepared. But I wonder if I can ask you just an opening personal question, just to kind of frame things for us. You're a professor of communications. You specialize, or at least have a deep interest in misinformation, disinformation, media literacy, et cetera. For you personally, just you, not necessarily Professor Carnahan, but Dustin. Dustin, where do you get your news every day? Like, where is your go-to news source?
Great question. In terms of wanting to understand what's happening internationally, for those of you who are perhaps news nerds like myself, you probably know that the American press doesn't do a wonderful job of that. I like to use the BBC, which tends to provide very high quality, detailed reporting on what's happening places other than home. But when it comes to what's happening domestically, I think I tend to be someone who looks all over the place. And I think part of that's inspired by my own curiosity of how what's happening in the world is presented in different ways, by different sources. You get different takes, different details, depending on where you visit. And so I kind of use a collection of different sources: Washington Post, New York Times, Politico, if you want that kind of inside Beltway perspective. Those are probably three of the ones I use most frequently.
And do you, I'm curious about your consumption. Do you do this on your phone, on your tablet, on your laptop? What is your primary device, your mechanical accessing of news?
Well, usually it's kind of a winding down sort of thing at the end of the day on my phone, but if I'm procrastinating from writing, usually it's on my laptop. So really,
That's right. You've got those notifications up, and they're all color-coded with procrastination. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think it is, we're all trying to figure that out. What can we trust? And trust isn't blind. It's not something that will just immediately go to any of these sources without that kind of critical lens. But still, it's nice to know someone in your position, you do at least have some confidence in what you can find.
Generally, yes. Again, it's, as we'll talk about here momentarily, it's a really noisy world we live in. And I think trying to decipher what we can feel confident in and believe requires that we don't just rely on one source, that we spend time with a lot of different perspectives. And that's challenging when we have so much on our plate, especially now. I know all of you are also probably preparing, or at least in the first week of teaching this semester, and it's time consuming. It takes a lot of effort, but part of the reason it's easier for me is it is my job. So I think that makes it a little easier.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for being here. I'm going to let you go ahead and proceed with the talk tonight. I'll moderate the questions as they come in. We'll find the appropriate time to take a break and maybe spend a little time on that. Thank you again for being here.
Oh, and I want to thank you also, and also the National Humanities Center for this opportunity. I also want to thank everyone who's in attendance out there. I do agree with the Zoom fatigue, so maybe not as personal and interactive as we might hope, but I do appreciate you taking time out of your evening, especially at this busy time, to listen to this talk. Again, the purpose of this presentation is really to provide a little bit of context to the issue of misinformation, to provide a sense of really what is this problem? When did it originate? What do we mean when we use terms like misinformation or disinformation? And then also at the end, to really start kind of exploring and thinking about, well, how bad is this problem and what can we do about it? What are the different types of solutions that we have at our disposal that we can use to make our students, to make citizens better equipped to exercise their civic duty or to make high quality public health decisions? And I saw in the chat as I was sitting here to start that a lot of you had similar sorts of concerns, that you see this all the time, but you may not necessarily know how to address it. And so hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll have a little bit of insight into this. But before I get into the talk in too much depth, I want to say a little bit about me and kind of how I got into this. Really coming of age at a time when the internet was booming, I was very interested in how people got the information that they use, what sources they chose to engage with. And that naturally evolved into wanting to learn more about how people came to believe what they believed. And so really as a grad student, I started getting interested in this question, and misinformation has been central to my research program ever since. Really with my research, I try to answer two questions. The first question is again, how do people develop their beliefs? What factors, what forces lead them to believe certain things to be true and other things to be false? But then a large part of my research agenda has focused on what or how effective are potential solutions, such as fact-checking, such as pre-bunking, we'll talk about in a little bit, media literacy training. How effective are these measures in ultimately changing beliefs? Once someone has already established an incorrect or false belief, how effective are measures to actually change those beliefs? And so in this talk today, I really have two big goals, as I've already kind of noted, to provide important context in the discussion of misinformation, and again, to explore what are some of the things that we can do. What are some of the things that we have control over that ultimately might allow us to make better information consumers into the future? And so to kind of preview the talk, things working properly here, the first thing I want to do is I want to define misinformation. What does it mean? How is it different than other terms that we oftentimes use synonymously, but perhaps incorrectly with misinformation? Then I want to talk a little bit about historical perspectives. I think Andy provided a wonderful segue into that, and I see that there's a future talk coming up in the next few months on some historical events that have been rife with misinformation. Is this a new problem, or what's different today compared to the past? I then want to talk a little bit about why we tend to believe this stuff. What is it that makes us susceptible to misinformation? Then kind of move forward into a discussion of ultimately how bad is the problem? Is this really this 21st century plague that's ultimately going to lead to the downfall of civilization? Or is this something that's more symptomatic of what's happening around us besides from the information environment itself? And then again, I want to conclude in a few minutes to talk about what we can do about it. What are the different solutions that we can implement in our own engagement with the information environment, or what things can we convey to future generations to make them more prepared, better equipped to deal with the challenges ahead? The first thing I want to talk about is, what is misinformation? We hear this term constantly. Over the past 6-7 years, you hardly go by a day where you don't hear misinformation or fake news. But what ultimately is it? Well, really, this has been a challenge for scholars, for academics, for philosophers even, trying to define what we actually mean by the term misinformation. And usually the definition that's most heavily cited suggests that there are really three types of claims or statements that qualify as misinformation. The first type is false statements, statements that stand in direct contrast to observed reality. In other words, statements that we know to be false, statements that there is objective evidence, scientific proof that indicates that that claim is simply not true. For example, the Earth is flat. Right? We have a history of observations suggesting otherwise. Right? Evidence, the best available evidence tells us that that is an objectively false statement. But beyond those statements that are objectively false, we also have statements that are misleading. This is where the definition gets a little muddied. Misleading statements are those that distort existing understanding of reality. So what we mean by this are things that perhaps are decontextualized, things that aren't necessarily reflective of what the actual event was. There might be some component of truth, but it's being presented in a way with the intention of misleading. So that's the idea behind misleading statements. And then third, there are unsubstantiated statements. Statements that are made without any evidentiary support. In other words, for example, you make a claim that, I don't know, the sky's going to be purple tomorrow. So for example, that sort of claim is unsubstantiated because there's no evidence that you're citing that actually says that that's what's going to happen tomorrow. And if indeed that does happen, it doesn't mean that you knew that ahead of time. It could be chance. But it was unsubstantiated because you were not necessarily citing any evidence, any basis of reality around that claim that the sky is going to be purple tomorrow. I know it's an absurd example, but bear with me. So these are the types of claims that we oftentimes describe or talk about when we're defining what it is to be misinformation. But misinformation isn't the only term that we hear tossed around when we have these discussions. We also hear, for example, the term disinformation. What separates disinformation from misinformation is intent. Disinformation is intentional. It is attempting for some purpose or in pursuit of some objective to spread half-truths or falsehoods. And we saw this, for example, in 2016. The picture you may not recognize or it may have no meaning to you, but this house was a house that was in Russia that housed the Internet Research Agency. So for those of you who may have been paying attention closely, in 2016, this was basically a group of Russian trolls, a network of Russian trolls who gathered together and used disinformation operations in order to sow discord and mistrust and chaos, really, during the 2016 presidential election. Just a little unassuming house on a Russian block somewhere. This was a disinformation effort because we know that the Kremlin had a specific objective in mind when they were spreading this. They were attempting to undermine democratic norms and elections in the United States. Misinformation, though, can spread innocently. That's why it's misinformation, right? You could just be having a conversation with someone. You're not necessarily trying to achieve any objective, but you reference something that's false. You're spreading misinformation, but you don't have any underlying intent. You're not trying to achieve some objective or goal. Another term you might hear a lot, probably have over the past few years, are conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are a little different from mis and disinformation in one key way. Conspiracies are attempting to explain an event, why something happened. And conspiracies themselves oftentimes do contain some element of truth. Some observation or some fact can have a basis, essentially, within a conspiracy, but then it gets warped and becomes part of a broader explanation to try to understand or explain a specific event. Here, for example, I've cited an explanation that's taken on some life of its own on the political right in the United States, that January 6th was not actually something that was undertaken by Trump supporters, but was part of, in a sense, an inside job, that the FBI was actively participating in sowing discord and anger on January 6th to kind of lead to what we ultimately ended up observing. This is a conspiracy, but perhaps there are some elements of truth to it. I'm not saying there are in this instance, but there could be some facts that are observed that are then intertwined together to kind of create this false or unsubstantiated explanation of a specific event. One thing that's interesting to note about conspiracies is sometimes they can come pretty close to the truth. And so one of the more, I think, infamous examples of this occurred in the early 20th century, when Woodrow Wilson became very ill during his time in office and ultimately was unable to carry out many of the daily tasks of the executive branch of the presidency. As a consequence, his wife, Edith Wilson, started actually signing documents and engaging in many of the day-to-day tasks herself. Journalists at the time, without necessarily any understanding or any factual basis for this, started to suggest that because they hadn't seen Woodrow Wilson out in public much, that he wasn't actually doing anything, that he was actually really sick, and that Edith Wilson must have actually been carrying out some of the duties of the presidency. It only was many decades later that Edith Wilson ultimately confirmed those accounts. So we do see conspiracies from time to time get relatively close to the truth, but conspiracies, generally speaking, are, again, tying together things in order to try to create some sort of explanation for it. So the next thing I want to talk about is a little bit of history. So again, we've heard these terms tossed around intermittently over the past 5-6 years, sometimes dominating the news cycle. But is there really something new and unique today that's happening with respect to mis and disinformation? Well, if you look back historically, actually, misinformation has had a long and storied history in the United States. And one of the ways I like to illustrate this with my students is to provide them with a scenario like this. And I say, stop me if you've heard this one. We had a presidential election. One side accused the other of working on behalf of America's adversaries, whereas the other side accused the other of engaging in rampant criminal misconduct. And I say, where have you heard this before? And they all say, well, Professor, I heard it yesterday, right? I heard it just last week. And this is a new problem, and it's this big issue. 2016, even to a lesser extent 2020, and I tell them, actually, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the election of 1800, an election between two of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, where Thomas Jefferson accused John Adams of working on behalf of the British Crown. He essentially wanted to go back under control of the British. As a matter of fact, there were suggestions from the Jefferson camp that John Adams was trying to get his daughter married to a prince of Great Britain in order to gain favor with the crown. John Adams countered with suggestions that Thomas Jefferson was pro-prostitution and pro-murder, and it was going to result in a very, very criminal republic. My favorite example of disinformation, because this was disinformation because it was spread with intent during this election, was where John Adams and many of his Federalist allies attempted to publish claims that Thomas Jefferson was in fact dead, in hopes that then people would not vote for Thomas Jefferson, because why would you vote for someone who is dead? And so we see this historically. This isn't something that's new, right? In our political system currently, we may think that this is a unique moment, but disinformation and misinformation has a rich history. Proceeding past the election of 1800, we look into the 18th and 19th century, some of the early years of our republic, and what we had during this time period is oftentimes characterized as the partisan press. In other words, the most important sources of information we had available to us were controlled by the political parties of the United States. And these parties were very eager to do the bidding. These papers were very eager to do the bidding of political parties during this time, often employing hatchet men who worked directly for the newspapers, whose job it was to publish unflattering, oftentimes false things about their political opponents. Some of the most famous hatchet men of all time, or one of the most famous hatchet men of all time, was James Callender, who at the time worked for Thomas Jefferson and was more than willing to put out negative story, oftentimes false stories, about John Adams during the election of 1800. But we saw this trend continue many decades into the 19th century. And then another example of newspapers being fast and loose with the truth during this time period was what's popularly referred to as Hearst's War. So William Randolph Hearst, one of the most influential newspaper publishers in American history, implemented in many respects what was called yellow journalism, which was this tendency to focus on sensationalized and dramatic presentations of the day's events in order to generate attention. But William Randolph Hearst also had his own political motivations. He had specific objectives that he sought to accomplish, and was very active during the Spanish-American War to push accounts of Spanish aggression that ultimately would lead to popular support for America going to war with Spain. These accounts were oftentimes dramatized, but oftentimes were flatly inaccurate. And the motivation for Hearst in this instance was, again, trying to build up greater support for and ultimately lead the United States into war during this time period. Now, historians look back at this time period because William Randolph Hearst, of course, he also had an inflated ego. He oftentimes took credit for the Spanish-American War. Historians look back and they say, well, he was exaggerating the extent to which he had influence over conflict between the United States and Spain. But what was essentially kind of indisputable was that he did show that newspapers, when they were playing fast and loose with the truth, could shape public support for conflict through the stories that they pushed, specifically if they were pushing false narratives or misleading narratives. And the United States has also had a history of implementing their own disinformation campaigns. This was especially evident during the Cold War. So Doug Levin, who's a scholar, studies disinformation techniques, found 62 instances where the United States specifically implemented disinformation tactics between 1946 and 1989. Many of these tactics were aimed at sowing mistrust through use of information campaigns and oftentimes disinformation itself toward regimes or candidates that were sympathetic to the Soviets or that had communist ties. In other words, they were engaging in disinformation tactics in order to try to maintain their sphere of influence and to ensure that pro-Soviet or pro-communist candidates and regimes wouldn't take power, specifically in countries in the Western Hemisphere. So while we oftentimes look at how other countries attempted to infiltrate our own elections through the use of disinformation tactics, we actually have a history of having done that ourselves, justifiable or not. The fact of the matter is we are not immune to the use of these sorts of tactics. So looking back, because misinformation and disinformation apparently is nothing new, the question then shifts to what's different today? What makes the current moment particularly worrisome with respect to mis and disinformation? Well, the first factor that's really important in this respect is the current era we live in with respect to the information environment. And that is, we live in an era of communicative abundance, right? Many of you in the audience chat prior to 7 o'clock were talking about social media. And the fact that people are on social media and they don't verify these things and they encounter so much of it and it's confusing and there's so much conflicting information, right? That in other words, you're pointing to this very issue, that it's really hard in an era of communicative abundance to discern what's real and what's not. It's a very noisy, confusing environment. And especially for many of you who are dealing with younger people, like I deal with in college classrooms, right? They don't know how to navigate. They don't know how to make sense of it. Oftentimes, one response to that is to ultimately pull away altogether. But other responses are to gravitate to sources because they might make you feel good, because they may be entertaining, that may not necessarily be particularly preoccupied with the truth. Another factor with regard to communicative abundance that really matters here as well is that there are so many sources, so many individuals and groups vying for our attention that it's incredibly competitive. And this, in a way, has incentivized disinformation. It's incentivized things like clickbait, because clickbait is profitable specifically because of the amount of attention it can draw in a very, very competitive media space. So in other words, mis and disinformation becomes a selling point, right? Putting out fantastic stories that may not necessarily be rooted in truth or may warp or distort an actual event, but because it's dramatic, because it has that wow factor, it can draw a lot of attention. We saw this, for example, in 2016. The stories that received the most engagement on social media in 2016 were stories, for example, that suggested that Pope Francis endorsed President Trump, or then candidate Trump, for the presidency. Right? These stories were so sensational, they commanded so much attention, and that's, again, one of the incentives of mis and disinformation. Attention means ad revenue. And so in a very competitive space, some actors have reverted to disinformation in order to stand out and to be able to sell their product. Obviously, social media plays a role in this. In many respects, social media has accelerated this process. Social interaction takes place instantaneously with social media, and we oftentimes default to trust in interactions with friends and family and coworkers because it's easier. It's a survival instinct. We do not have the resources to validate and verify everything that someone is telling us. Because the speed and the frequency of interaction occurs so regularly, we oftentimes, again, engage in these conversations where we're either wittingly or unwittingly sharing false claims or misleading claims, and we're never taking steps then to verify them. So social media has certainly sped up this process. And we're going to circle back to kind of how and why social media does this in a little bit. But then another factor that's really important today is that there does appear to be a growing sense of anti-intellectualism and anti-elitism in the United States. This is very much has its roots in the populist movement we currently see happening not only here, but in many Western democracies throughout the world. One of the things that's notable about this growing anti-intellectualism is that it's imbalanced. Primarily appears to be was occurring amongst the political right in the United States. So, for example, in the 1970s, Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. Roughly trusted science and scientists at the same rate. But over the past 50 years, trust in science has maintained its current levels for Democrats and independents, but has precipitously decreased amongst Republicans. So we see this imbalanced sense of anti-intellectualism and anti-elitism. And so we have less trust in what experts say. We have less trust in what scientists say. And when you have that, what starts to happen is people begin to question official accounts. They start to suggest or they start to worry that what they're being spoon-fed by elites, by elected officials, is a version of reality that maybe they should be skeptical of believing. Now, there's always healthy amounts of skepticism. There's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, skepticism is one of the tools that we can use to fight against mis and disinformation. But the problem is if people are in a position where they're no longer willing to trust scientists and experts and people who actually have decades of experience working in specific fields, it allows other voices to swoop in and begin to shape the conversation. And oftentimes these voices are not necessarily operating from a place of fact. So that's really what separates the current moment from the past.
So, Professor, I wonder if we can take a pause and respond to some questions that have come in. This seems like a good segue before you set up your next section. We've got one question that comes from Jim in Macomb, Illinois, and he's wondering if you can tie up some of what you're sharing right now in this long view to either the evolution or the deconstruction of journalism, in particular local journalism.
That's a wonderful, wonderful observation. As a matter of fact, I feel like Jim from Macomb should probably, join my research team because one of the questions that we're pursuing, we just submitted a grant to the National Science Foundation earlier this month to investigate what are called essentially local news deserts. Mm-hmm. And what these local news deserts are is, if you've been paying attention in recent years, there has been a dramatic decline in the number of daily newspapers in the United States. And this has resulted in some communities that aren't served by even a single daily newspaper. You also see the implementation of paywalls, which has been a measure that local journalism has adopted in order to survive, again, in this very competitive media space. And paywalls themselves, their purpose is to allow these organizations to sustain operation, to employ journalists, but at the same time, they create barriers to information access. And when you look at poll over poll over poll over the past several decades, local news is one of the few media institutions that people trust. And so what you see is this decline of one of the few voices that people are willing to go to and believe, and that space is being filled with something else, right? And when you have these other options like social media, like blogs that have shown a long history of being very loose with the truth, that creates a situation, I think, personally, that could facilitate some of these very problems. And so it's a wonderful question because it's a question that we seek to learn more about in our research. And I think he's onto something for sure.
And it seems, to maybe put a finer point on that, it seems that one of the big distinctions between even a small local newspaper that is independently run and a blog, or maybe even a corporate takeover of these smaller newspapers. But the big difference is that journalists as professionals have an ethical code and they have a legal protection whereby TikTokers and bloggers and people just kind of yelling on the street corner don't have any of those kinds of legal and ethical boundaries. Is that, in your opinion, part of what's accelerating this process?
I think that's also probably true. In other words, again, these reputable voices dictated by professional norms of what is and isn't journalism, what is and isn't newsworthy. It's not to say that they're infallible, right? But it is to say that they're at least governed by a code of how they should respond, how they should report, what they should focus on. That when you lose that, what becomes then the alternative? And like you said, oftentimes what happens, it's the loudest voice that fills the space, right? It's not the most accurate voice. It's not the voice that's actually concerned with getting the facts right. It's the person, if you have two individuals on the street corner and one of them's got a megaphone, you're going to listen to the person with the megaphone because they're louder. And so I think that certainly plays into this, that what's filling that space are people who aren't governed by an ethical code and have no accountability. That's the other, I think, element to this that
right.
I don't know what we're getting at. But there's no editorial accountability for the blogger or the TikToker or the Twitter user, right? That if they get the story wrong, they just go about their day. Whereas if the journalist gets the story wrong, they print a retraction. It's very minimum. It's a blow to their professional reputation. At most, it results in you losing your job. And so I think that certainly does matter here.
Yeah, thank you. This question comes from Ida. Ida is in Los Angeles, LAUSD, and notes that the media is protected by the First Amendment, but, at least in Ida's opinion, that's also a barrier to solutions and truth. Professor, how do you address and justify this with your students?
So what you're raising, I think, is one of the biggest philosophical questions we have to grapple with when we think about solutions. And I touch on this later, so I don't want to spend too much time on it now. But there is this tension between ensuring the integrity of the information environment, that people can and will get good information, versus allowing for freedom of expression and freedom of the press and people to say what they want to say without repercussion. And I think that tension ultimately is why you see a lot of inaction, because I don't know if anyone's got the answer to that. And so how I address this with my students is I just say, where do you stand on this, right? To what extent are you willing to accept restrictions on what can be said and what perhaps consequences can result, versus the real concern that you would lose protections on your ability to freely express yourself. And some countries, have taken a more aggressive stance on this. And so, for example, the Poynter Institute has a wonderful resource that allows you to look at what policies have been implemented in countries around the world and their democracies, like us. And they've been much more restrictive on this, even fining people for knowingly posting misinformation online. But in the United States, I think because of our history, because of our political culture that values to such a degree freedom of the press, freedom of expression, it does serve as a barrier to our ability to implement any meaningful changes to how to grapple with this.
Yeah, fantastic. We have a lot of questions queued up. I want to say to everyone who submitted a question, we will definitely bring them in, and I'm sort of melting them out at different points during the night. But I'd like to conclude with one more question, Professor, and then we can move on to your next session. And this may or may not be in sort of your circle of confidence in how you can respond. This comes from Lauren. Lauren is joining us from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And she's wondering if you can talk a little bit about the factors, in your opinion, that have contributed to the distrust of science and the scientists among Republicans beginning, let's say, 50 years ago.
Great question. And so this is another area that's kind of, it's not exactly in my purview research-wise, but it's something that I have a lot of interest in. I do have some papers where we look at what we call politicization effect. And that's really, I think, what has contributed to this imbalanced shift where we see a rise in anti-intellectualism, specifically on one side of the political spectrum, but not the other. I think what happened in the 1970s, began in the 1970s, were legitimate concerns being raised about things like climate change, where evidence started coming in concerning the potential for greenhouse gas emissions to significantly warm the planet. And what we observed in the beginning in that time period was a one side of the political aisle that was a threat to them, and they tried to politicize those facts by. And when we talk about politicization, I should define that before I go into too much depth or kind of explanation here. But politicization just simply involves playing to the inherent uncertainty of science. And so science is always uncertain, and what we try to do as scientists is to reduce that uncertainty to the extent that we can by ensuring that our findings are not due to chance. And so we have replication, and over many, many years, we study the same topic, and we try to generate some degree of consensus in order to reduce that uncertainty. But science is still uncertain. It's evolving. It's always changing. And so what started happening in that time period was that the political right utilized that inherent uncertainty, calling into question findings and research, challenging these explanations. And ultimately, I think what an unintended effect of that was that people started then to question what the scientific community was saying about a number of matters of national importance, not just climate change, but for example, as we witnessed over these past 2 years, things like COVID, that you started to see an imbalance in who was willing to trust whom as a result. And I think that is the primary reason why you started to see that beginning in the 1970s.
That's a great point. And, saying this from a office that sits in Durham, North Carolina, it does seem more than coincidence that in the early 70s, science and research and evidence starts to really challenge our lifestyles, like tobacco. Tobacco use
I was
is
gonna
a
say,
big problem.
yeah.
Right?
And that is another instance that historically has been extensively studied in terms of politicization and how, they had lobbyists successfully pushing these messages, calling into question scientific evidence about tobacco use and its effects. And it was successful toward their aim, but it had this other effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for spending time on those questions. To the audience, please do continue to submit them. Why don't we move forward?
Sure. So now another segue, right? The kind of moment of where we're at now. Right now we're in the era of TikTok. And, like I said, social media is an accelerant. There's so much out there. As some of you, I'm sure, are aware, around last year, during our time in lockdown and in social distancing, we had a lot of free time on our hands. And one of the things that happened during this time period is you started to see, even in young people, some of these tendencies manifest. And I think the most illustrative and infamous example of this was this rather large uprising of young people on TikTok openly doubting the story of Helen Keller, suggesting that she wasn't a real person or her story has been greatly exaggerated. And while many people laughed at this, I actually had students in college classrooms telling me, that this was something they were seeing, and a lot of people said that they believed it. And so while we laugh at it because it's, of little consequence, it certainly harms the legacy of Helen Keller. It doesn't really have any implications for how we lead our daily lives. But it does seem to suggest that, especially amongst young people who we oftentimes think of are more digitally savvy, they're able to navigate this space more effectively, that they themselves can fall prey to this. That information, disinformation, misinformation, and fake news can spread freely on these platforms, and even those who we think are best equipped to deal with it might actually fall prey to it. So this segues into the next question. So why do we believe this? Why do people believe, for example, that Helen Keller wasn't a real person? And there's a number of different explanations or factors that help us explain why we believe in misinformation. One of the most important factors is when we have gaps in our existing understanding. So in other words, people oftentimes, again, we think in terms of narratives. We think in terms of cause and effect and how this affects that. But sometimes we can't know everything. We can't see everything. And we don't necessarily see these connections. We have, in a sense, kind of a narrative gap. And when we have these narrative gaps, because people inherently dislike uncertainty, will gravitate to anything that helps us fill in that gap, that helps us improve our understanding. So this doesn't necessarily mean it has to be true. So long as it makes us feel better about what we think we know, we oftentimes will believe it. So when we have these gaps, this is where misinformation, again, can swoop in and fill it. And then, again, that can spin off into other things, other beliefs that are not necessarily factual. And this is a real problem. In addition to gaps in understanding, we also have what are called metacognitive experiences. So metacognitive experiences are actually not as complicated as they sound. So again, what a metacognitive experience is not the content of our cognitive thoughts, but more so other characteristics of our cognition that can make us more or less likely to believe certain thoughts are more likely to be true or more likely to be false. So again, it's not the content of our thoughts, it's other characteristics of those thoughts that make us more or less likely to believe them. And two specific metacognitive experiences that we talk about a lot in this literature are accessibility and fluency. So accessibility specifically speaks to how easily something comes to mind. So if something comes to mind very easily, for example, a common myth that we hear a lot, and I talk to my students, I use this as an example in my class as well, is that taking vitamin C after the onset of an illness, a cold, can ultimately help you heal faster, right? That this just makes sense. It comes to mind because our parents said it over and over again, which is accessibility, but it also makes sense, and that's what we call fluency. Things that are easy to understand, right? We learn from a young age that vitamin C is good for us, so it makes sense. It's easy to understand that that's something that should help us feel better after we begin to get sick. As a matter of fact, though, evidence suggests that that's simply not true. That taking vitamin C prior to the onset of illness can certainly help our immune system fight it. It can help us prevent illness. But after we're already sick, there's no real scientific evidence suggesting that it can reduce the duration of illness or make us feel better faster. So again, accessibility is how easy something comes to mind. When something's been repeated to you over and over and over again, it comes to mind more easily, you're more likely to believe it. But when something's easy to understand, when we have what we call high levels of fluency, that's another feature that can make us more likely to believe something that's not true. And Schwartz and colleagues call this the illusory truth effect. And when you encounter something a lot, it becomes easier to understand. And when it's easier to understand, we're more likely to believe it. Third are the role that mental models play and how we organize our thoughts about the world. And this is where a term that I saw come up in the audience chat earlier as well comes into play: confirmation bias. Right? This tendency for us to accept things that fit within our existing worldview. The reason we do this is because, in a sense, when we have our thoughts in our minds, they're not just scattered all over the place, right? That we use cognitive schema to organize all of our thoughts into mental models. So it looks like this, right? We organize all of our thoughts together, we put together connections, and we establish how things relate to each other, and we create these coherent cognitive structures or these mental models. When we encounter new information that fits within that model, it's very easy for us to accept it. This is the logic of the confirmation bias. That when we encounter new information that fits within our existing schema, it's very easy for us to integrate that information into our mental model, to make other connections. Similarly, information that doesn't fit our existing explanations, doesn't fit so nicely into our cognitive schema, is easy to reject. It's easy to discount because it doesn't fit. We call that the disconfirmation bias, which is the exact opposite, right? It's this tendency to disbelieve anything that doesn't fit within our existing cognitive schema. And because we do this, and again, there's good reason why human cognition happens this way. It helps us understand what's happening, and it helps us organize our thoughts about the world in ways that allow us to say more than just what the individual facts are. It allows us to integrate our thoughts about something. There's good reason to do it. It can lead us astray, specifically, for example, when misinformation that sounds good, that fits neatly, we may be more willing to bring that in. Another feature that can influence our beliefs is what we call perceived social consensus. And this is a particular issue all around the board, but I see this a lot in younger audiences as well. That there is a tendency to want to believe something so that you belong. And so when you perceive that a certain belief is held widely within your community, your friend group, your family, we oftentimes will use that as a cue to guide our own beliefs as well. Another reason we do this is we don't want to be ostracized. We don't want to harbor a belief that's inconsistent with the beliefs of these other individuals whom we hold dearly, whose groups we belong to. And so when we perceive that there's a consensus, we are more likely to endorse that belief as well. And one of the reasons that this is more concerning today is that social media oftentimes acts as an amplifier. When we see one claim, we don't just see it once, we see it posted by this family member, that family member, this friend, this member of the sorority. We see it over and over again, and so we tend to exaggerate how common certain beliefs are held within our friend groups, within our social groups. And our research has actually looked specifically at this component, and we find consistently that people exaggerate. They actually have a very poor sense of how common certain beliefs are within their social groups, even when they're groups that they harbor dearly, that they have a strong attachment to. The people you would think they would know about, they actually don't. They actually have these very exaggerated views of how common certain views are within their group. And then lastly, there's the concern around media literacy. So media literacy is just a way to describe how people go about understanding what it is they can trust and what it is they can't, right? Being able to develop skills and understanding of, I can put stock in this, yet I should be skeptical of this, right? And as the digital kind of disruption of the past 20 years has unfolded, we've seen these advances occur so quickly that there hasn't necessarily been a complement in terms of how prepared people are, specifically all types of people, but specifically older people, at being able to navigate these transformations. When you're using, for example, 20th century techniques to know what is true and what's not in the 21st century information environment, you're creating a situation in which you're likely going to come to a great number of faulty judgments. Simply because this era has transformed so much, we have to navigate with extreme degrees of caution. But while we oftentimes think of this as a problem that plagues older generations, research suggests that younger generations aren't very good at this either, the generations that perhaps you're more concerned with. So a really influential study out of Stanford in 2016 did a study of 8,000 students ranging from middle schoolers all the way to college-age students. These audiences were really good at discerning what was a good news article, what was an actual news article versus what wasn't, but they were horrible at discerning what's called native advertising. So native advertising, in a nutshell, are advertisements that are designed to look just like news articles. And you see here, this is an example from the online website, online magazine Slate. It's a left-leaning magazine online. You see that sponsored content right there, even though it says sponsored content, but the headline text looks very similar to the rest of the font being used on the homepage. The problem is people aren't necessarily very discerning. They're not looking at that sponsored content. They think that whatever that is a news story. So when they click on it, they think they're reading the news. The problem is they're reading an advertisement which is designed to persuade them, which is providing very likely a biased version of reality. And when you see this sort of tendency, the concern exists that people can fall prey to perhaps mis and disinformation that's also designed to look very similar to legitimate news articles, legitimate news organizations. So these are just a few. There are several other reasons, and I don't have enough time to go into all of them, but these are just a few of kind of the primary factors that go into helping us understand why do people believe in misinformation. So the next kind of topic I want to spend some time on is ultimately how bad is the problem. So again, we've heard all about this. We know now that, hopefully you know now that this is something that does have some historical precedent, though certainly contemporary times have created new challenges to issues surrounding mis and disinformation. We know why people might fall prey to mis and disinformation, but given how much it's talked about in popular spaces amongst pundits and scholars and politicians, you might think that this is sort of the end-all, be-all problem that we're facing as a society. And certainly there are legitimate concerns about mis and disinformation. For one, we find consistently that fake news and misinformation spreads faster than the truth. So a very influential study from 2018 that looked at what were called rumor cascades, which is essentially how many times a specific falsehood was tweeted and retweeted, kind of an unbroken chain. What they found in this study was that fake news traveled faster, it reached more people, and it traveled further into people's networks than true news. And each of those three plots on the side, I don't necessarily expect you to be able to interpret them just from their presentation here. The red line is the false headlines, the green line is the true headlines, and you can see in all three of those metrics how deeply the story traveled, how many people it ultimately reached, and how fast it achieved certain levels of depth. You see that the red line extends further out than the green line, indicating, again, that the false news travels deeper, reaches a larger audience, and at a quicker speed than true headlines. Second, we know that mis and disinformation can have really important implications for civic and public health outcomes. And if you need any evidence over the past 2 years, you can probably just look out your window, right? But we see troubling trends throughout the United States on vaccination rates, for example, oftentimes spurred on by illegitimate concerns around the MMR vaccine. The infamous publication from Andrew Wakefield that was published, I believe, in 1999, but I might be wrong on that, suggested a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. And this was published in a very influential medical journal based out of Great Britain. And ultimately, it was retracted after there were a number of issues and concerns that were generated about the study's methodology as well as potential conflicts of interest. But that single publication, despite the fact that hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of attempted replications have not established any such link whatsoever between the MMR vaccine and autism has corresponded to a large decline in many states throughout the United States in childhood vaccination rates, to the point where the states in red in the map that I'm showing, you actually see these states starting to fall below herd immunity levels, or the level of vaccination that's needed in a community that will essentially protect vulnerable populations who for some reason are unable to receive the vaccine. Which means that in some of these communities, some of these states, we've seen outbreaks, for example, of the measles, where the disease, which was ultimately declared to be largely eradicated from the United States, I believe in 2000, we've seen outbreaks ranging from hundreds to thousands of people as a consequence of these declines in vaccination rates. You're also seeing long-established policies being challenged on anti-scientific grounds, for example, fluoride. We've seen a number of communities who are attempting to reverse policies that involve putting fluoride in public drinking water systems based on, again, unfounded and unproven claims that they can reduce IQs. And so you're seeing towns and communities putting their children's oral health at risk, which we know that there's a significant correspondence between oral health and overall physical health, simply because they believe in falsehoods surrounding the potential effects of fluoride. We've also seen, again, concerns in terms of public health, civic outcomes as well, people, supporting candidates who advance certain sorts of claims. But I talked too much about politics, so I figured I'd change course here and talk a little bit about public health for a few minutes. Third, another concern around the spread of mis and disinformation is the fact that even when we're successful in counteracting it, even when we go about successfully correcting it, that mis and disinformation can continue to have an effect on our opinions, attitudes, and ultimately our behaviors, even after it's been debunked. This is because, in a sense, what happens is the correction doesn't fully reverse the effects of the original exposure to misinformation. We call this the continued influence effect. And we see consistent evidence over 3 decades that even when we're successful at correcting people's misperceptions, they oftentimes will still be impacted in some way by the initial misinformation in the way they think, and sometimes even the way they act. Fourth, we've seen high-profile examples of how mis and disinformation can foment animus, extremism, and violence. I saw someone reference, for example, Pizzagate in the chat before I began the presentation. This again was inspired directly by unfounded claims surrounding a pedophile sex ring by liberal elites in the United States, and that it was operating out of the basement or back room at Comet Go-Go, which is a pizza place in DC. This was all based on an email between John Podesta and the owner of the pizzeria about hosting a fundraiser, and ultimately the whole thing spiraled. Ultimately, it evolved into what we know today as QAnon. But what happened ultimately in 2016, shortly after the election, was an individual walked in with a rifle and loaded, and they shot open a back room door to try to find the ring. He found nothing. But again, it could have been so much worse. And then, of course, we have January 6th, which was fueled by claims of an illegitimate election, by rampant voter fraud that has yet to be in any way, shape, or form corroborated by any evidence whatsoever, despite the efforts of many. And so the fact of the matter is these sorts of claims can stoke division, violence, and there are obvious concerns that in the future, if unchecked, this could become a bigger and bigger problem. But one of the bigger problems that we hear talked about a lot with respect to mis and disinformation is many people suggesting that this is part of an alarming trend that ultimately leads to authoritarianism. And the logic here is that with respect to authoritarian regimes, one of their most important tools is to corrupt and distort the information environment, which would allow for greater social control. And I think I could give you some spiel or some sort of explanation as to how this could happen, but I think Hannah Arendt would probably be better equipped to do this than me. So Hannah Arendt, famous philosopher. First off, this is an amazing photo of her. This is how academics used to be, I guess, 50, 60 years ago. I think very clearly outlines and details this concern, that in an ever-changing and incomprehensible world, the masses had reached a point where they can believe everything and nothing. And she, I think in many respects, is demonstrates a great deal of foresight in this observation by saying that you could believe the most fantastic lie today, and even the next day, if you're told with irrefutable proof that it was false, you would be able to revert to cynicism, right? There's this idea that you would be able to argue back and not believe, and this ultimately makes you susceptible to control. And many people have argued that we're moving in this direction, and I'm sure you may have heard the expression, a post-truth era, where many people argue that we're moving to a point where no longer will truth in fact become an important player in the way we live our everyday lives, and instead it will be based on intuition and feeling rather than truth in fact. And this is exactly the concern that oftentimes has been addressed with respect to what will happen if this problem goes unmitigated. But that said, other evidence suggests that perhaps this alarm is a little premature. For one, even though we lament the state of social media, and I think sometimes for very good reason, misinformation is still only a fraction of the content people encounter online. In other words, we might see some of these stories, but most of us see very little of this content. Now, there are, for example, and some research has fleshed this out as well, a very small number of people who are responsible for most of the dissemination of misinformation. I believe there was a study done during the kind of early months of the COVID pandemic that indicated that 12 users, specifically just 12 users, were responsible for the majority of all false content shared online. And furthermore, there's research that indicates that more than half the population sees next to no misinformation, and that there's only a very small group that sees frequent, constant misinformation in their timelines. So there certainly are people, and these people can wield important influence in elections, but also in other outcomes, such as violence. But the fact of the matter is most people see very little of this. It's actually a very small portion of what we see. And what we do see, other work suggests it's not all that consequential on things like voting behavior. Alcott and Genskow, for example, tried to examine the effect of fake news in 2016, and they found that it only, at most, had the effect of a few hundredths of a percentage point of the popular vote. So, again, in 2016, the election was ultimately decided by 77,000 votes in 3 states. So to say that it wasn't consequential might be an overstatement. But again, we're talking about very, very small percentages of people who are actually moved by this content. And where most of my work lies, we do see consistent evidence time and again that we can change the beliefs of even the most steadfast believers, that fact-checking interventions can work. Some of the work that I've done has suggested that even those individuals who were extremely confident in their beliefs, in their incorrect beliefs, changed their beliefs and did so durably in response to fact-checking treatments. The effects that we observed were observed up to 1 month later. So this suggests that people are still responsive to facts, that we haven't necessarily entered this post-truth world. But this does ultimately pose a question. Is misinformation a cause of our social ills, or is it an accelerant, or is it merely a reflection of the broader political context that we find ourselves in? And I think this is a question that I don't necessarily have the answer to. I tend to believe that really misinformation is a symptom rather than a cause, but it doesn't mean that it's not consequential. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have meaningful and important effects. I'm still thinking through that philosophically, so don't hold me to it right now. The last thing I want to talk about now is what can we do? What types of measures can we implement to successfully combat or push back against this problem? Unsurprisingly, a lot of effort and attention has been focused on regulation, policies designed to restrict the flow of misinformation. One such policy has been proposed at the federal level. It's called the Honest Ads Act. This is a policy that essentially just extends certain sorts of requirements that are currently in place for television or print advertising to social media as well. This proposal was put on the floor in 2017, and 5 years later, it still has not passed. It's stalled in Congress. There has not been enough support on either side of the political aisle to pursue it. And as a consequence, it still hasn't occurred. And again, I think this reflects this fundamental tension in terms of our political culture as a society to restrict speech, right? It runs counter to many of our values for for freedom of the press and freedom of expression that we kind of alluded to in that conversation earlier. But beyond that, there are other challenges with regulation that has made it very difficult. For example, what legal definitions can be put forward? We know legal definitions can get very messy. We've seen the Supreme Court try to do this, for example, famously with obscenity, where I know it when I see it became the legal standard of how we define obscenity. But in order to restrict or regulate something, you have to first define it. So establishing an agreed upon legal mandate or statute to determine what is or isn't misinformation, what is fake news, what is disinformation, what is intent, I think becomes a real challenge when it comes to trying to regulate. Also, there's questions of accountability. Is it the platform, the social media platform that we should hold accountable, or should it be the individual user? I think these questions, again, when we had this conversation about Section 230 in the Federal Communications Act, that this is a sticking point between right and left in the United States. As a matter of fact, both agree that something needs to be done about the power of social media platforms to regulate and restrict certain types of speech, but they can't necessarily agree on what needs to be done. And so, again, who's accountable, who's responsible, who should ultimately be held to the fire is a question that I think we haven't necessarily resolved. And then I won't spend much time on the philosophical question because we've kind of already alluded to it. And one of the big challenges with regulation is, to what extent are we willing to accept meaningful restrictions on our ability to express ourselves freely in order to achieve an information environment that is more suited around truth? And again, this is a question I think that is ongoing. I don't know if anyone has the answer. So given that regulation poses a number of challenges, what then can we do? Well, first, we can implement what we call prevention or pre-bunking sorts of measures. And the reason why I lead with prevention is because research has consistently shown that pre-bunking, giving people the tools, giving them the practices that allow them to better navigate the information environment, consistently outperforms correction. In other words, I think some of you even pointed to this in the chat. People, when they believe something, it is hard to uproot it. It's not impossible, as our research has shown. We can definitely change beliefs, but it's a lot harder. Whereas leading people, giving them the tools to be able to navigate the information environment efficiently and with truth in mind, does a much better job. So the types of prevention tactics that we've seen implemented over the years, some things that you may even implement in your own teachings when you're dealing with students and you're trying to promote better information practices, is first off to have students think and ask themselves, how does this make me feel? The reason that this is an incredibly important first question is that disinformation is designed to elicit a strong reaction, specifically a strong emotional reaction, right? This is for two reasons. One, it's to get you to click, right? That we know disinformation can be lucrative. We see people peddling in it for purposes of making profit. But also, it's designed to make you angry at somebody. It's designed to make you hateful or resentful toward a political opponent, for example. And so having people simply stop and ask themselves, how does this make me feel? And to think about, well, why are they trying to elicit that reaction? Can be a really important first step. Beyond having them do any additional effort in terms of research, right? Having them ask themselves, well, wait a second, this made me feel this way. Maybe that's what they wanted. And maybe I should ask myself why. Why did they want that? That can be an incredibly helpful first step. Second, teach strong verification practices. As I alluded to in my introduction a little bit in response to Andy's question, right, look for whether or not a story is actually being shared by multiple sources. Is it just this one place that you saw it? Or did you see it anywhere else? Right? There is strength in numbers in many respects when it comes to determining whether something is false or true. But that's not always true, right? Oftentimes the right wing or the left wing media systems will echo each other. They'll put similar sorts of headlines out, and ultimately, you can be deceived by thinking that you saw it in multiple different places. But this is where you have to go beyond just looking and cross-verifying across a number of different sources, right? You should take measures to then start learning about those sources. What is their intention? Look at the About Us section. Learn a little bit about the journalist. The reverse image search. This is another thing that we probably ourselves, because we're older, don't use anymore, right? We've never done this before, but a reverse image search is something that's very simple to do in Google, where you take an existing photo and you basically just import it into Google, and it will tell you if this has been published somewhere else. One of the biggest telltale signs of disinformation is they don't actually have their own photographers. So what do? They take stock images, or they borrow images from other organizations, and they manipulate them, or they change them. And you should be able to see that in a reverse image search, which can give you a sign that maybe I should be careful about believing this. Legitimate news organizations have their own photographers. This place is stealing all their photos from somewhere else. And then there's efforts toward media literacy training. The example I have here, Stop, Reflect, Verify, was a highly successful campaign in Kenya that was designed to help people navigate social media over there. Specifically, I'm drawing a blank now on the one that's now owned by Facebook. I can't remember what it is. If someone remembers, put it in the chat. But specifically outlets that aren't familiar necessarily here, but are very familiar other places. They've put public campaigns forward to try to help equip audiences to know, be careful, slow down, spend some time verifying, think about what they're trying to do. And this has been shown to be rather effective at making people more cognizant, making them more conscientious information consumers. So prevention is our number one strategy, but sometimes we have no choice but to correct. We cannot always anticipate when and how and where misinformation will strike. So for those of you who are dealing with students who are repeating or expressing false claims in the classroom, and you want to step in and intervene, here's some things that you might consider. For one, attack the falsehood, not the person. This is really hard to do. I'm sure we all have that person in our family who spreads a lot of nonsense, and all we want to do is to call them an idiot, right? And say, what are you doing, right? We don't want to do that. Because once someone feels personally attacked, their immediate response is to get into a defensive posture, at which point they're not going to listen to anything you're going to say, right? So it's attacking the falsehood, not the person. It's being empathetic. It's expressing understanding. It's recognizing that their intentions are good, even if their conclusions are flawed, and identifying ways for you to inject yourself into it to have a reasoned discourse around that claim. Again, it's tricky, but with some patience and a little bit of communication talent, it can be done. Second, lead with the facts. I had you read the Debunking Handbook, and I strongly recommend that as a resource. That is a consortium of advice from dozens of scholars working in this space over many decades. One of the first suggestions they make is lead with the fact. Right? When you're trying to confront someone, start with the fact. Don't immediately go to why they're wrong. Begin with, well, actually, this is more realistic. This is what the truth is. And they provide a really nice visual demonstration of this in that reading that indicates kind of a nice little structure. Begin with and end with the fact. Provide an alternative explanation for what it is that they think they know. And beginning with the fact and ending with the fact is a way to kind of make the facts of the situation more salient, make it more accessible, make it more fluent, make them easily understand it. After that, as much as it might pain you to do this, and I frankly admit that I have trouble with this too, interpersonal interventions are the best. Talking to people, having conversations. It's not enough to just share a fact-checking article, as much as we might want that to be the end of the conversation, right? But having conversations, as difficult as they may be, have been shown time and again to be more effective than media messages in changing beliefs, attitudes, and opinions. And so to the extent that you're comfortable and you're skilled enough to navigate those tricky interactions, I tell you, do it as much as you can, as much as you're comfortable, because they work. When you're able to establish that connection and have a genuine discussion, you tend to see greater results. And then lastly, self-correction. This is where, again, I know many of you have probably assigned a research article, a research paper, and you ask people to engage in some sort of exercise and research, to learn about it, to write a paper. And you would probably be absolutely in horror at what they come back with, right? The citations that they use. And you go, how did you do that, right? For us, it was a lot easier. When we had to do a research project, we had a physical library that we had to go to, and we had to read encyclopedias and other reference type books. It's hard, right? The problem is that people, when they're sent off on their own, right, you're asking them to make good decisions themselves. And so getting them to think about the sources that they're using is very effective as well. In other words, we kind of self-correct them, right? You want them to come to the correct conclusion on their own. That is more powerful and it is more durable than anything that anyone can say to them. And so promoting and fostering a healthy sense of skepticism, right? Having them not just believe the first thing they read, having them actually engage in deeper levels of research, making them investigate further, making them defend and explain their references and their sources, right? These sorts of things create good habits where people might initially fall prey, and I fully admit I have myself, to misinformation. But subsequently, through this additional investigation, through that healthy skepticism, I'm able to kind of course correct on my own. And this is an incredibly important skill that people can use to try to foster this sort of climate and making people feel comfortable with being wrong, so long as they can come to the correct conclusion on their own. So just to briefly conclude, right, the main points of the talk, right, the misinformation, this isn't a new problem. But what is absolutely the case is that this threat continues to evolve. Some things that I haven't talked about, but certainly could be a focus of an entire discussion, are new technologies such as artificial intelligence and softwares that allow for the creation of deepfakes. These are kind of the next front in the battle against misinformation. For those of you unfamiliar with deepfakes are incredibly realistic renderings, videos or audios of people, public figures, talking, saying things that they never said, performing actions that they never performed. We've seen examples of this online. If you go onto YouTube and type in deepfake, you'll probably find some really, really funny Nicolas Cage examples, where they put Nicolas Cage in every movie that's ever been made, and it's hilarious. And in that context, it's funny, right? But you know, there are legitimate concerns, and the national security agencies in the United States are taking this threat very seriously and attempting to try to figure out what to do with deepfakes, because it's not implausible to think that attacks might be launched in response to an artificial rendering of a president saying, we have invaded such and such country. And so these sorts of concerns are very real, but we're not there yet. The one thing I want to reassure you with is we're not there yet. This technology has not yet advanced to the point where it's a major concern. However, within 5 to 10 years, it could. And so this next front is going to be really interesting. And there needs to be some very, very difficult ethical conversations of the use of artificial intelligence. But even though the threat's evolving, again, we can understand more about us. What doesn't change is human tendency. And understanding why people believe what they believe can be an effective tool toward helping us be able to successfully navigate and deal with the problem of misinformation. And the last thing I'll conclude with is the earlier we're able to do this, the better. Right? The more skills we can convey to people at younger ages are going to be more successful, are going to be better at creating future generations of information consumers who ultimately will be able to deal with these problems that maybe today we're flummoxed about. And so the sooner we do this, the better. And I think that's ultimately what I have to say today. I really do appreciate you all and you spending your time with me this evening. I also welcome any comments or questions via email. If you have anything that you'd like to ask about or learn more about, please reach out. And so thank you very much.
Destin and Professor Carnahan, thank you so much. We do have some questions that have queued up, and I'd like to use our remaining 5 minutes to get through some of them. But I'm really struck by the last, 10 or minutes or so of your talk tonight. And as I look through the comments, I noticed that Lauren said, sometimes she sort of paraphrased, sometimes facts do nothing if the person is emotionally, I'm sorry, just scrolled out of my view. If not emotionally connected. I'll tell you one thing that humanists do well is tell stories and create narratives.
Yes.
And so it could be too that all of the humanities teachers in the room right now are part of that solution, being able to find those emotional hooks to the reality that you're describing. And I believe I'm right in saying that I think the January 6th committee has tried to do that, actually hiring people who can write the narrative much more clearly and provocatively. Couple of questions for you, though. These are coming in at in different ways. The first one's from Francesca. Francesca is a college-level educator at the University of Tampa. And to paraphrase her question, Francesca says that while she teaches digital literacy at the college level, she goes over this work. Her students, they're compliant. They maybe think it's novel or even fun to take quizzes like Spot the Troll. At the end of the day, they still don't seem to apply it to their regular daily lives. As a college educator, Professor, what's the answer? How do you get that application of what you're describing?
No, I mean, that's a fantastic question, and I'm not going to sit here and say that I have all the answers. One of the exercises I have my students do is I have them produce their own fake news article. There might be some ethical concerns here, but what I do is I say, okay, look how easy this is. I give them some very basic competence in how to program in Google Chrome and how you can manipulate any site to say whatever you want. And students are usually alarmed at how easy it is. And then I take it one step further. I say, create something on your own and show 3 or 4 of your friends and see how they react. And many of them come back with the same sort of response, which is they didn't even ask. They saw it and they believed it, and that was it. And they create some of the more outlandish things. Like, I work at Michigan State, so somebody created one time that said Tom Izzo retired. And this is something happening on campus that if it were to actually happen, everyone would be talking about it. And the student believed it without question. And I think that experience makes it personal for them. They actually see how easy it is to produce and how easy it is to deceive. And it makes them, I think, much more conscientious through that experience, right? And learning the mechanics and the simplicity that goes into this, I think, really is eye-opening. And even if it's not perfect, right? I think trying to make it hit home as much as you can is probably the answer to that question. And again, I'm not going to say that I've mastered it, but I've seen some success in some of the things that I've done, and I've had to say I feel like I'm much better now at knowing what's real and what's not.
Chris, thank you. And I do want to be clear to our audience that Professor Carnahan is not suggesting that you simulate creating a troll farm. You're not making new trolls for the future.
No. Like I said, there might be ethical concerns there, but very, very controlled. Very controlled.
Yep. Let's pivot a little bit. I've got a few questions specifically around journalism and journalists. And many of our high school level teachers do teach journalism, and it's part of the foundation of the American democracy and culture to consider this angle. I'm going to combine these, actually. One comes from Lori, one comes from William. Lori's a former journalist, and she's expressed some concerns about the erosion of the modern ethical journalistic standards. She admits that she's a little bit of a worrywart, and she's curious if you have a similar concern. And at the same time, William notes that he's wondering what the punitive actions are against journalists who are caught spreading dis and misinformation, other than, as some of our TV personalities have done, suddenly claim to not be a journalist.
Well, with respect to the first question, I mean, I do think that there is some reason for pessimism, right? But I also, I want to end on a hopeful note, and that is that there is still tremendous work being done by countless numbers of journalists out there, right? That they are taking the measures. They are becoming more active, for example, on social media in confronting, these falsehoods where they're happening. And I think what journalists need to do is just learn to navigate this new space, right? I think they're still in the process of doing that, and I think that they are finding their way. But as for whether there are ethical declines, I mean, I think I think the system to some degree incentivizes that. One of my interests that's not so much an academic interest, though it kind of is media economics. And when the end-all be-all of the journalist is to sell the story so that advertisers can make money, then the ethical calculation changes. It becomes less about informing, it becomes more about entertaining, it becomes more about attention. And I think that that's always been a problem, especially over these past 50, 60 years when we see media conglomeration on the scale that we've seen it. And I think the challenge is, well, okay, given that and given some of the restructuring we see in newsrooms where there's fewer numbers of journalists covering just the same amount of news, if not more, how can we fill that space with good stuff? And again, I don't necessarily know the answer, but there are experiments on, for example, civic journalism, public journalism that's being done throughout the country that have yielded good results. There's proposals to boost public broadcasting, and there are things that need to be entertained to try to reestablish that. Can you repeat the second question? I know you combined them.
Well, I think the second question is what the consequences are if a journalist is found to aggressively be spreading mis and disinformation.
Well, I mean, again, the consequences I think are, to the extent that they matter, reputational and organizational. But when you have these outlets that are operating not in good faith, for example, like Newsmax or Infowars, that's part of the business model, right? I mean, it's kind of difficult to impose any meaningful consequence when that is being used to sell the product, and when misinformation, disinformation is part of the product. And so I'm not sure there is an easy solution to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor, I want to echo all of the chat and the congratulations in the audience chat for tonight's session. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights. We really do appreciate your guidance in this complicated topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I do want to thank our entire audience for joining us tonight. Thank you for attending the first of 43 episodes of the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series this year. Please do follow our social media, particularly our Twitter feed, to see upcoming opportunities and webinars, as well as on-site programming that we have planned for both the winter and the spring. And I do hope to see you at our next webinar, which, it's only 2 nights from now. I'm not sure who scheduled all these so close together. I'll be joined on September the 1st, Thursday night, by Eric Loomis, professor of history at the University of Rhode Island, and he'll discuss his work in labor history, in particular how to rethink teaching about labor history and the strike in this era of economic inequality. Please do take a moment to share this with your colleagues and your department mates, and I hope we see you, if not Thursday, at a future webinar sometime soon. Hey, everybody, please do have a great first week, first month, first couple of days of school. I hope the transition back into fall is a good one. I hope you have a wonderful group of kids. I'm sure you will. And I'm looking forward to spending some evenings with you this year. Thank you again. We'll see you next time on the Humanities in Class webinar series.